This is not the right moment for African states to pursue isolationist strategy because the continent lacks the cohesion and institutional redundancy required to absorb the risk of heavy regulation. Joseph told you three things, and I'm going to weigh this up to all of the clauses thus far. First issue on capacity. Powers across much of Africa is still fragmented between domestic elites and weakly insulated bureaucracy, which means policy outcome rise or fall on the judgment of individual leaders rather than durable institutions. That's why this type of approach is not really popular in Africa in the first place. That is an unstable base for isolationist or heavy state control because every election, cabinet reshuffle, or political crisis risks abrupt every policy reversal. In lateral terms, if you create a government-centric economy, you first need to ensure that the political sphere of the states are stable, in which we say it isn't, because different political dynasties and hegemonies with their own selfish interests are competing to get leverage over the other in most of African countries right now. So even if we give the best case for Gulf, that you can experience the benefits from this model, it will still fall after 1 to 2 election cycle because Magufuli style of governance centralizes powers in personalities rather than institutions of it. That's why once the term ends, another political dynasty can easily take over, which is unfortunately normal in Africa. Because, again, aggressive oversight under Magufuli relied on discretionary enforcement, executive intervention, and politicized regulation shocks. This creates a fatal structure problem because the system only works while the strongman is present. So two problems already. One, not all African nations can have good leaders to begin with. And two, even if they do, the political sphere of them is shaky to breed long-term consistency of this outcome. Second issue on sustenance. In practice, expanding state control under this condition does not strengthen authority. It just creates the following. First, you have politicized regulators, and also you will also have inconsistent enforcement that businesses immediately price into higher costs. Meaning, you need to rewrite contracts and most likely regulate these industries, and the problem here already explodes when you do the basic capacity analysis for Gulf. Ask yourself, outside the political problem, do you think that most of severely harmed large industries in Africa can self-sustain? We say that they can't for now. They don't have that much technology. They're suffering from years of investor reliance. And at the end, they cannot mass produce and do efficient control of these areas. That's why they're going to do costing. That's why, at the end of the day, they will require a lot of trade-off for normal African citizen. That's why you will literally kill your own industries permanently and you will go back to our style of our counterfactual. But the problem is you will offer a lot more cheaper rates in order to be accepted because you ruined your industries in a worse, unattractive condition during these moments of cycle. This is the reason why our counterfactual is and was prevalent in Africa in the first place. And this needs to be linear. Like you open up your market, wait for the growth to stimulate, then close your market when you already have the capacity to self-sustain. That's why that's why government really ruins this momentum and banks on a far worse cycle because we still can't do this in the first place. And what if, hypothetically, they can self-sustain? We already told you that it will take a lot of utility and time. That's why you're cooking your own consumers in Africa. A normal citizen will carry the harms of Gulf. It's so disingenuous to assume that they will have higher labor rates when this blank slates requires trade-off and cost-cutting that is one of its primary strategy to survive. And far worse, since African economies are still racing to scale basic inputs like electricity, transport, and all of this urgent problem, these costs are not absorbed quietly. They show up as supply shortages and price hikes. That's why you are literally killing your own state once you do this. These are the urgent problems that Africa firstly needed to solve before deciding to shift the image of their market that they themselves will have a hard time to regulate. Sure, TPPY.
It's not accurate that they will increase their prices because of competition. Many companies won't want to lose patronage and lose profits. That's why they will not allow, because if they make themselves unaffordable, people won't patronize them. No company would want to do that.
Okay. Just do the basic capacity analysis. They are not as large as MNCs. They don't have the capacity to mass produce. They don't have the same conditions that you will have from these MNCs in the first place. That's why cost cutting is far more realistic to do so. That's why every blank slate economies do this. And again, going back to my case, the most likely result in Gulf is a slower state, thinner markets, and consumers paying more for essentials. And far worse, the benefits from them is very, very speculative, especially if you test their likelihood. So it's not likely for Gulf to succeed since African nations will just face another revolutions due to this factor under this issue, since they will carry these burdens for a long time. And again, you go back to the cycle of clean slate after these revolutions because people are not taking any POI. People are getting angry after suffering all of the state regulations that they have and failing so. And this requires another open market to regulate this new industries for you after revolution in a cheaper rate, because they're sultry. Since you push them out, you will require far more effort to get them back. That's the cycle that is happening in Africa right now, and that is another cycle that you will breed in your side in a far worse condition. Since by that time, there are probably these investors in the first place probably already have a tighter relationship with other regions in other continents. This means losing all of the infrastructure and long-term relationship that they have with China, for example, that they could have expanded even more. In essence, you ruin your continent optically at the crux. Next, on the impeding problems, civil wars in Africa. The hard truth is simple. MNCs were able to exploit African resources because governments permitted it, and not because states were powerless by default. But walking away from these firms does not fix the problem. If governments remain corrupt, the same governments will still mismanage resources. Because, for instance, in the DRC, exploitation did not happen because MNCs magically overpowered the state. It happens because the state's institutions were hollowed, captured, and complicit. That's why, under Mobutu and after mining concessions were routinely granted through patronage networks and contracts, MNCs operated abuses were enabled by corrupt intermediaries. That's why in their world, this will just be replaced by another domestic African corrupt corporations with the capacity to stimulate these industries, because let's be realistic. There's no existing benevolent alternative right now. And this is why, even domestically, you get the same outcome. So where do we access the benefit for general populace of Africa then? Our response to this is simple. The point of tax break and is not to be nice to corporation. It's to buy competition, to buy leverage, and to buy time. So the state can convert foreign capital into public capacity. If the question is, how do we get benefits for the general public? The answer is that incentives are a bargaining tool to manufacture market, wherein a lot of investors will try to outcompete each other once your market is already attractive for them. Note that this also fixes all of the problem, because all of these long-term benefits will be accessed, and you will have the capacity to be isolationist once you do this in the first place. And you can have the power to renegotiate all of these terms once your industry is thriving. That's why we agree with all of your dreams, but there's a linear timing where it needs to happen, and that is not today.